Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Mukham karoti vachanam, pangam nangate girim, yatpakamam vande, Shri Gurudinataranam, Paramanandam Madhavam. Hare Krishna, thank you for joining. So we will resume our discussion from the fourth canto, chapter 25. This chapter is essentially the description of the characteristics of King Puranjan. And the earlier part of the chapter kind of finishes off the Pracheta's engagement with Lord Shiva. And beginning from the third verse, which we'll resume, we'll see the conversation between Narad and the father of Pracheta, Prachinavari, and the allegorical story that he will tell him. So verse 3. Prachina Bari Samkshataha Karmasvasaktamanasam Narado Dhyatmatatvagya Kripalu Pratyabodaya. While the princes were undergoing severe austerities in the water, their father was performing different types of fruitive activities. At this time, the great sage Narad, master and teacher of all spiritual life, became very compassionate upon the king and decided to instruct him about spiritual life. So the Prachetas were performing austerities for future success. Essentially, austerities are performed to get a position and more exalted position later on. And they make one eligible. So the Prachetas were performing austerities for devotional advancement, for following the instructions of their father 10,000 years from the start of the austerities. Those that try to occupy a position without the proper purification, even if they are somehow able to forcibly occupy it, they get eventually removed. So the example is that of Bali Maharaj, that he forcibly occupied the position of Indra without performing the 100 Ashwamedha Yagyas. Now, after he had performed it, he had occupied it, he had engaged the Brahmanas, or rather the Brahmanas had engaged him in performing the Yagyas, but it was not the right way. He had the process backwards, which is why the Lord removed him. So one should first become qualified and then occupy the position. So the austerities of Prachetas is an example of this. Now, while Lord Shiva instructed the Prachetas about Bhakti, Narad Muni, he will instruct Prachinabari about Jnana and Vairagya and eventually Bhakti. So Prabhupada says that the goal of the Karmis is promotion to heavenly kingdom. For the Jnanis, it is merging into the Brahman effulgence. So the Jnanis are superior to the Karmis. And Prabhupada says this is confirmed by Mahaprabhu, Koti Karnishta Madhye Eka Jnani Shreshta. That one Jnani or impersonalist is better than many thousands of fruitive persons. Now, one may wonder that what is it that suddenly attracted the mercy of Narad Muni? Because Maharaj Prachinabari was already famous for performing Karmakanda. And the understanding is that when the Prachetas were following the instructions of Lord Shiva, they were engaged as sadhakas in the performance of bhakti. And the Lord is so favorably inclined to his devotees that he is quick to give mercy not only to the devotees, but to the ascendants and descendants. So even though the Prachetas had not perfected, they were still sadhakas. But the mercy of the Lord was available as if they were perfected. Narasimha Bhagwan says to Prahlad Maharaj that when a pure devotee appears, then so many generations forward, so many generations later on, they are liberated. But the point that is made over here is that the Prachetas had still not become pure devotees. But the mercy of the Lord is already appearing. So Prachina Bari had this special connection, that he was a descendant of Dhruv Maharaj, another pure devotee of the Lord, and his sons were the Prachetas on their way to become pure devotees. So that attracted the mercy of Narada Muni. It's also noted that sages like Narada, they focus their instruction on great personalities because of their great impact. Narada Muni is preaching to Vyas, they're preaching to, in this case, Prachina Bari, because the kings often, they have a very strong influence on their kingdom. So, being an adept preacher, Narada Muni is always looking to see how he can influence the most number of people. In the 9th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, when Krishna speaks about the most confidential knowledge, he says Raj Vidya Raj Guyam. Right? So Raj Vidya, one translation is that it is the king of all knowledge. Other translation, it is a knowledge specially meant for kings. For this reason. Again, in the 4th chapter, Krishna makes this point, Evam Parampara Praptam, Imam Raj Rishu, that the kings, Raj Rishu, proper translate as saintly kings, that they were part of the Parampara. So those who, because of their past piety or qualifications, get into the position of kings, they are also attract the mercy of the devotees because of their position. The verse also gives the quality of Narada Muni, which qualifies him as an ideal preacher. So Maitreya says, Adhyatma Tattva Gya. So he was full of Adhyatma Tattva Gya. So he was full of spiritual knowledge. And Kripalu, he was compassionate. So just having knowledge is not enough. One should really feel the pain of others. So like the sages of Naimisharanya, Srila Prabhupada glorifies them in the purport that they were compassionate, they had knowledge, and they were prepared to endeavor for the benefit of others. So this thing is important. How does one relate to others? Out of compassion, for the benefit. And that's the quality of a properly situated preacher. We see in the pastime of Maharaj Vena that when Maharaj Vena was becoming more and more impious, then the Brahmanas, they debated amongst themselves. They said that we are Brahmanas, we have nothing to do with political intrigue. So we should not interfere with political matters and remain impartial. But then they also said that we are Brahmanas, we have the power to rectify it. And if we still do not act, then we will be like a leaky pot that will eventually lose all knowledge. So it's not that a person who does not help others will uh, not make progress, but what they're saying is that they will actually lose their realizations, lose their knowledge, because they have the ability to help, but they are not. So Prabhupada makes this point over and over again, that if one has the knowledge of Krishna consciousness, then it behooves them to spread it. That is the quickest and fastest way to make advancements. Okay, let's move on to the next verse. Shreyastvam katamadrajan karnatmana ihase dukhahani sukhavapti shrehastanne hacheshyate. Narad Muni asked King Prachina Barishat, "My dear king, what do you desire to achieve by performing these fruitive activities? The chief aim of life is to get rid of all miseries and enjoy happiness. But these two things cannot be realized by fruitive activities." So Srila Prabhupada expands on this, that fruitive activities ultimately result in miseries. And Narad Muni, he begins his conversation by attempting to understand the motivation of Prachina Bhara. So, important first step in preaching. Sometimes in preaching, we focus on speaking. But as the more experienced speakers will tell you, that preaching is mostly about listening. Most of the people are not very open to somebody coming them and telling them that everything that you're doing is incorrect and wrong and will lead you to a miserable destination, and I have the solution for you, do this. So you would have already lost them in the first few minutes of the conversation when you're telling them how they are doing everything wrong. But inviting the person to share their motivations, to share their expectations, that establishes a connection. And we see Narad Muni first doing that. So it is said that from the perspective of preaching, there are three categories of people: the rishis, the rakshas, and the yakshas. Now, this is categorization. Does not mean that there are rakshas preachers, but based on the nature. So the rishis are deeply spiritual, and at the same time, they're very compassionate to the suffering of others. So they will take practical action to help others and do the needful. The Rakshasas are the opposite, and they will live at the cost of others. So they will cause pain to others as a way to please themselves. So if they preach, they will either preach things that are not bona fide, that could destroy the spiritual life of other people, or they will preach in a way that will be derogatory to the person. Sometimes you see people preaching and they'll use a lot of derogatory labels. These people are karmis, they are heading to hell, and then I remember once we had some kind of a gathering, like a spiritual gathering at our home, and there were some children that were just very rambunctious. They were kind of disturbing the lecture. And then one of the Mataji comments that, you can look at these children and see that none of them are 64 round children. And I looked at the parents and I could see the parents felt really, really bad about it. So sometimes people, I'm not to say this particular devotee does that on a regular basis, but just probably just a one-off observation. But sometimes, people preach to make others feel bad, and sometimes people just preach outright wrong philosophy. They will misguide. They're the Rakshasa kind of preachers. And the third is the yakshas. So the yakshas, they live for themselves without bothering others. So they will not consciously cause pain to others, but they are unaware of the suffering of the others. So they are those who will just focus on their own welfare, right? To kind of in between the rishis and the rakshasas. So that's from the perspective of preaching. Now, from the perspective of being preached or receiving the instructions, it is said that there are 4 kinds of people. Now, this is also a fairly generalized division that you will see outside scriptures also. It's based on one's self-awareness. So there are the kind of people who know and know that they know. Right? So they are considered to be leaders and should be followed. So personalities like Narad Muni, Maitreya, Sukdev Goswami, they have knowledge and then they're aware that they have knowledge. So they are willing to lead. The second category are those who know, but they do not know that they know. So they are considered to be asleep and should be woken up. So there's the example in the first canto of Narad Muni preaching to Vyasadeva. Like he says that all this is known to your good self. You need to just realize it and write it. So this is when Narad Muni is motivating Vyasadeva to write the Bhagavatam. He says, you already know everything. So all you have to do is to become aware of it. And then we see other great personalities that go through phases, like when Dhruv Maharaj was killing the Yakshas, or Jamjay was killing the snakes, or Parashar Muni was killing the Rakshasas. They knew that it was not the right thing to do. But for whatever reasons, they forgot about it circumstantially. And then there was somebody that came and reminded them. Swayambhavu Manu came and reminded Dhruva Maharaj. The Brahman Asita came and reminded Jamjay. Parashar Muni was reminded by Pulastha Rishi. Pulastha Rishi came and reminded Pulastha. So different people come in and remind, and then they are properly set. The third is the category of people who do not know, and they are aware of the fact that they do not know. So these are innocent, and they can be led. Right? So we have the example of Mrigrari, Vidur, Parishit Maharaj, the sages of Naimasharanya, that they're asking questions because they know that they do not know. And they're receptive to whatever is being told to them. And then finally, there is the category of people who do not know and do not know that they do not know. Basically, the people who are ignorant, but they consider themselves to be very wise. So classic example is King Vena. When the Brahmins went to preach him, then he started criticizing the Brahman and started very authoritatively speaking on a whole demon philosophy line that Narayan should not be worshipped. He resides within the body of the king, so the king should be worshipped. So not only was he was ignorant about his ignorance. Same thing when Prahlad Maharaj was preaching to Hiranyakashipu. Then he just kept thinking that Prahlad Maharaj is speaking nonsense. Right? So he lacked the understanding but was not willing to accept the fact that he lacked the understanding. So here we see that from the perspective of preachers, Narad Muni falls in the category of a rishi, right? That he is pained by the situation of Prachinabhari. And by asking these questions, he's trying to ascertain which category does Prachinabhari fall into. So one of the interactions in preaching is to determine this. I remember in a temple there was a new Mataji. She had come, very, very enthusiastic, and she was so enthusiastic in her preaching. I remember that once there was a Prabhupada disciple, and very senior devotee, of course, but very well situated also. And he had just come in non-devotional clothes. And she immediately caught hold of him and said, you're not the body and you should be chanting Hare Krishna. And he said, yes, Mataji, I'm chanting. So, yes, but you should chant 16 rounds. Yes, I'm chanting 16 now. Yes, but you should be chanting consistently. Finally, after some time, somebody took her away and said that, he's been chanting for the last 40 years. So one of the things in successful preaching is to determine where the recipient lies, right? Whether he's a leader, then the preaching should be inquiry. Or the person knows but just needs to be reminded, then like Narad Muni, very, very respectfully, giving just very, very general directions. Or if the person is genuinely interested, then give knowledge. Or if the person is envious, then one should avoid the person. So we will see from subsequent verses that Prachinabhari, he actually falls in the third category. That he accepts the fact that he does not know. So he's open to the instructions of Narad Muni, right? So that's a good combination where a rishi is instructing a person who can benefit from the knowledge and is accepting the fact that he needs the knowledge. Srila Prabhupada makes some important points in the purport. He says that in the material world, no one can attain happiness without working hard for it. And the process of working hard is sometimes or often mistaken to be happiness. Even the result of this is not happiness. So sometimes people consider hard work to be happiness, that I'm working, like they say that I'm engaged in so many constructive pursuits, I'm busy all the time. So sometimes they simply consider the work to be happiness. Or sometimes they say I work hard and it's a bit of a drudgery, but the result is happiness. Prabhupada says that neither of them can be happiness, nor the work, nor the results of it. And the reason is that there is no such thing in the material world. And this is what distinguishes the hard work of the devotees from the non-devotees. The devotees also work hard, but for the devotees, the work is genuinely giving happiness and the result is lasting happiness. The exact opposite of those who are materialistic. Okay, verse 5. Rajo vacha na janami mahabhaga param karma pavedhadi bruhi me vimalam jnanam yena muccheya karmabhi. The king replied, O great sage, O great soul Narad, my intelligence is entangled in fruitive activities and therefore I do not know the ultimate goal of life. Kindly instruct me in pure knowledge so that I can get out of the entanglement of fruitive activities. So Srila Prabhupada talks about the nature of fruitive activities. We'll see in several of these purposes, Prabhupada generally tends to quote from scriptures, from one of the Upanishads or Bhagavad Gita. But here he quotes from some of the songs by previous Vaishnava acharyas. So here he quotes from Narottam Das Thakur's bhajan Gaurapava, that as long as a person is engaged in fruitive activities, he is bound to accept one body after another. This is called karmabandha pass, entanglement in fruitive activities. And then Prabhupada expands on it by giving a contemporary example. He says that in the Western countries, it is not unusual for one to take birth in a rich aristocratic family. Nor is it unusual for one to have a good education and a very beautiful body. But this does not mean that the Westerners are free from the distresses of life. Right? So Prabhupada makes this point that one may have a material comfort like food and clothing and facilities for sense gratification, but they continue to be in distress. And Prabhupada says they're so distressed that they become hippies, and the laws of nature force them to accept a wretched life. Thus, they go about unclean and without shelter or food, and they're forced to sleep in the street. So, what's the conclusion that Prabhupada says? That one cannot become happy by simply performing pious activities, right? So, this is how Prabhupada is connecting it. That people who are born in wealth or with good education, good material endowments, it can be understood that it's a result of past pious activities. But as Prabhupada illustrates, that despite the past pious activities, they are still miserable. He says this is called karmabandha fast. That they will keep transmigrating from one body to another and not really achieve happiness. So Prachinabhari, he recognizes this karmabandha pass and he's inquiring from Narad as a bona fide guru to find a way out of it. And Prabhupada says that such an inquiry is the real beginning of one's spiritual life. Because Prachinabhari could have said that I'm happy. I'm performing because all the yajnas that he's performing is under the guidance of Brahmanas, is based on the scriptures. Right? So he could have said, I'm happy. But being genuine, he could understand the point Narad Muni was making, and then he inquires from him. So Prabhupada said, this is actually the state of knowledge indicated in the first verse of the Vedanta Sutra, Atato Brahma Jigyasa. So Atato Brahma Jigyasa means, therefore, let us inquire into the nature of the Absolute. So it is said that that after the study of the Purva Mimamsa is essentially Karma Kand. It's basically fruitive activities. The recommendation is that one should inquire upon Uttar Mimamsa, which explains the underlying philosophy of all that has been done previously. So that's why it is said that after reading the Purva Mimamsa, the question comes now let us inquire into the nature of the Absolute. So Jiva Goswami in Paramatma Sandarbha, he explains that Purva Mimamsa is like the Purva Paksha that is actually refuted in the Uttar Mimamsa, which is the Vedanta Sutra. Right? So that is why this injunction comes in the opening statement of the Vedanta Sutra. Prabhupada comments that when one actually reaches the platform of frustration in an attempt to discharge karma bandha fast, he inquires about the real value of life, which is called Brahma Jigyasa. And then quotes Mundaka Upanishad, that Tad Vigyartham Sa Guru Eva Vigachat. So the inquiry should not just be a material inquiry, but it should be from a bona fide spiritual master. That is the actual business of human life. Jivasya tattva jigyasa na artho yascheha karmavi. That this is the real purpose. Jivasya tattva jigyasa. That the only business for the human being is to inquire from a spiritual master about how to escape this entanglement of karma bandha paths. Verse 6. Graheshu kutadharmeshu putradar dhanartadi na param vindate muro brahmyam samsara vartmasu. Those who are interested only in a so-called dutiful life, namely remaining as a householder entangled by sons and a wife and searching after wealth, think that such things are life's ultimate goal. Such people simply wander in different types of body throughout the material existence without finding out the ultimate goal of life. Now, Maharaj Krishnabari is a king, so he is not only trying to redeem himself, but also others. So when he says those who are interested, now he's already accepted that he is in the category, but now he's saying there are others also who are interested in so-called dutiful life, means basically a life that is pious in the mode of goodness. And what they get is essentially another body, life after life. So he uses the term Kut Dharma. Kut Dharma means false occupational duties. So we can see that Maharaj Prachinabari, he is already aware of Karma Kand, he is already aware of spirituality. Prabhupada said this means that Krishna consciousness was available to even greet kings in the earlier ages. And this also gives us a sense of how fortunate we are to have received this by the mercy of Mahaprabhu and Srila Prabhupada. So we see that sometimes materially advanced celebrities, great people, they take shelter of saintly people because they see that all the material endeavors are resulting in miseries. And then they are attracted by the simple happiness of saintly people. Right? The Beatles were a prime example of that they were as close to God in the 60s. Famous, wealthy, adored by everyone, very, very successful. But the more they got it, the more they could see that it was not giving them real happiness. So that's why they were going everywhere, trying to find for the simple happiness of saintly people. We see Maharaj Prachinabari doing the same thing when he's inquiring from Narad Muni. So Prabhupada says that the word Brahmyam Samsar Vartmasu are significant. In Chaitanya Charitamrita, Mahaprabhu clearly explains Brahman Brahmitakona Bhagyavan Jiva. That all the living entities are wandering in different types of bodies throughout different planets. And if in the course of the wanderings they come in contact with the devotee by the direction of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, their lives become successful. Even though King Prachinabari was engaged in fruitive activities, the great sage Narad appeared before him. The king was very fortunate to be able to associate with Narad, who enlightened him in spiritual duty, spiritual knowledge. It is the duty of all saintly persons to follow the footsteps of Narad Muni and travel all over the world to every country and village just to instruct them. So that's the main point Prabhupada wants to make. That it's the duty of all saintly persons to follow in the footsteps of Narad Muni and travel all over the world to every country and village and save them from the entanglement of karma bandhana. It's also interesting to note that the statement by Maharaj Prachinabhari over here is actually going to be more or less the main theme of the allegorical story that Narad Muni will tell. So one will wonder that if Prachinabhari already knows this, then why is Narad Muni still telling him? And we'll see the answer in the story. But essentially, there's a difference between knowing it at a theoretical level and by understanding it through details. Somebody may say that you need to exercise and be healthy, and the person may register that. But then when actually somebody comes and says that you do 10 minutes of push-ups and 5 minutes of treadmill and walk. So when the person gives more details, then it becomes actionable. So Prachinabhari here is indicating that he knows the principle, that fruitive activities simply result in repeated miseries. Now Narad Muni will again give the same message to the allegorical story, but with a lot more details. And then most importantly, he will also complete the allegory by explaining how can one escape from this cycle of fruitive activities. Okay, verse 7. Narad vacha Vobo Prajapate Rajan Pashun Pashya Tvayadvare Samgyapita Najiv Sangam Nigrena Sahasrasaha. The great saint Narad said, O ruler of the citizens, my dear king, please see in the sky those animals which you have sacrificed without compassion and without mercy in the sacrificial arena. Vishwanath Chakravarti Pad states that Narad Muni, by his mystic powers, was able to show in the sky all the animals that have been killed by Prachinabhari. And Srila Prabhupada, in the purport, he explains why. So Prabhupada makes these points that one should transcend the ritualistic ceremonies and try to understand the real purpose of life. Now, in order to do this, one needs to cultivate Gyan and Vairagya. And of the two, Gyan is more important because with Gyan, one will develop Vairagya. So without Gyan, one cannot become detached from material enjoyment. And without being detached, one cannot make spiritual advancement. So Prabhupada is talking about how the process begins with Gyan. So Narad Muni will be giving Prachinabhari the knowledge of samsara. Samsara is the material world. So that he develops Vairagya, detachment from fruitive activities. So that vacuum that is created can now be filled with spirituality. So it is said that unless one is hungry, the person cannot appreciate the most delectable food items. And if the person is fully satiated, then you may put all kinds of savories and all kinds of food items. it's not going to attract the person because he has no hunger. So first thing that Narad Muni is doing is creating hunger. Right? So he's saying that you look at the consequences of your attempts to make material advancement. To make this material advancement, you have committed so many sinful activities. And he's giving animal sacrifice as one, but indicating that so many other sinful activities. Now, Prachinabhari may object that how can you say this animal sacrifice is sinful when they are actually being done according to the injunctions of the Vedas by qualified Brahmins? So as we know, the Vedas say that the sacrifices benefit. Such sacrifice gives the animals either a human form of life or gives them a young, rejuvenated body, and everybody benefits. The animal benefits, the performer of the yajna benefits, the priest benefits. So Srila Prabhupada explains this further, that while it is true that this kind of violence is considered pious because it is given in the scriptures, but it is also true that any kind of fruitive activities has always got the potential of having trutis. So the point that Narad is saying is that you have performed so many yajnas. Out of that so many yajnas, there were some yajnas that were performed incorrectly. So the animals that were sacrificed in those animals were essentially murdered. They did not get the destination. Right? So because a slight mistake can give the opposite goal. So Prachinabhari had previously admitted that he lacked the understanding of the ultimate goal. So first thing that Narad is telling him is that your current activities are not conducive to obtaining a desirable goal. Right? And this he will expand on in the allegorical tale of Puranjan. And after having clarified that part, then he will tell him what the actual goal is and how to attain it. So we see that religions in the world, they typically use 4 things to motivate the practitioner, right? So they will use fear, that if you don't do this, something bad will happen to you. Like if you don't surrender to Jesus, eternal damnation will happen to you. So that is fear. Then gain. So gain means that if you do this, you will become rich or healthy or loved. Third is duty. The religions will say that this is your duty to do it. And fourth is love. So fear is considered to be the most preliminary level, right? And at the other end of the spectrum is love, where the gopis, they're saying that we are happy to give the dust of our feet to Krishna and go to hell forever, just because they cannot stand Krishna suffering from a headache, right? So when Narad Muni is preaching to Prachinabhari, he will be taking him through these stages. Right now, he's instilling fear in him, that you're performing these karma kanda activities. The nature of karma kanda is that there will be mistakes that are done. And because of the mistakes, you will suffer. For example, he says, look at those animals. They're waiting to kill you, just like you have killed them. Okay, I'll do one more verse, and after that, pause for discussion. ete tvam sampratikshante smaranto vaishasham tava samparetam ayha putesh chindantya utita manyavaha. All these animals are awaiting your death so that they can avenge the injuries you have inflicted upon them. After you die, they will angrily pierce your body with iron horns. So this is Narad Muni instilling fear in Prachinabhari. That don't think that what you're doing right now is a guarantee for happiness. Now, one way is that even if it did everything perfectly, it will still not give happiness. But Narad Muni is getting to him to even a lower stage. That you can't even do these activities perfectly. So the results are going to be even more harmful. So Prabhupada first makes this point that when one does animal sacrifice according to the Vedic injunctions, then the animals get promoted to human birth. Similarly, he says, killing the enemies on the battlefield, the Kshatriyas get elevated to heavenly planets. And the kings punishing the criminals, they are actually accruing pious activities. So Narad Muni is not really contradicting the scriptures, right? So Prabhupada says all these points are valid, but what he says, Narad Muni wanted to convince the king that overindulgence in animal sacrifice is a risky business, because as soon as there is a small discrepancy in the execution of such a sacrifice, the slaughtered animal may not be promoted to a human form of life. Consequently, the person performing the sacrifice will be responsible for the death of an animal, just as a murderer is responsible for killing another man. When the animals are killed in a slaughterhouse, 6 people connected with the killing are responsible for the murder. The person who gives permission for the killing, the person who kills, the person who assists, helps, the person who purchases the meat, the person who cooks, and the person who eats. So, Narad Muni wants to draw the king's attention to this fact. Animal killing is not encouraged, even in a sacrifice. Okay. So let me pause here and see if we have any comments.
Hi, Krishna. Just one point of clarification. You were discussing that there are 4 things that religious people do to get people to surrender to their religious path and like that. And you mentioned fear, and you explained that that is what Narada Muni is using here in the case of Maharaj Prachinabhari, King Prachinabhari. I was thinking that largely this is the tactic for the way that modern religion, will do to get followers and people to surrender. Just like in Christianity, they'll preach a philosophy called fire and brimstone. If you don't do this, then you burn in hell and like that. Having said that, I understand the last point you made in terms of love with the gopis and like that. I'm thinking about the other 2. You said gain and duty. And what are examples of gain? Is it the point that was made in Bhagavad Gita about the 4 types of people who come to Krishna? Or is it the demigod worshippers?
It is primarily, so gain is essentially of promising a person some material gain. So like
Okay.
Karmakand is a Christianity also. Most of the religions, they use primarily fear and gain. So at one point they say, if you don't do this, this will happen to you. And if you do this, you'll get some kind of opulence or elevation. Mostly in the area of, we can map it to Karmakand.
Okay, so it's like sort of like what we could say allurement, just things to allure people.
Yes, yes.
Mhm.
And duty is like sadhakas. So they do it mainly because they understand that they are supposed to do it. Right? They may not have strong material desires. They may be philosophically strong enough to understand that the fear and gain part of it is not the real motivation, but they understand that it's the duty to do it. So they are mostly the sadhakas. And then eventually the sadhakas mature to love, where they don't do it out of duty, but because it gives them real pleasure.
Mm. So we could say that love is the topmost, but the best among the three is at least dutifully, engage in religious practices, because from that dutiful point, one can just go higher from there. It's like, another way I tend to see it is that the others are in the lower modes, but at least dutifully means that you are like more closer to the mode of goodness. Am I correct?
Yes, yes. I would say dutifully is more close to the mode of devotion, not even goodness. It's more because goodness comes in the second category, where when people start, pious people aspire to get gains. They give in charity, they expect in charity. So that's piety. Dutifully are the people who are not doing it for any reward, but they're convinced that this is what they're supposed to do. So they have already transcended the modes.
Can we use the word Vishuddha Sattva?
Yes, yes. So they are entering into that area of Shuddha Sattva. And we have we are sadhakas. Of course, we are mixed devotees, but our aspiration is to not all of us have a spontaneous love for Krishna, but we still do, because we understand that that's what we're supposed to do. So with proper with proper guidance and mercy, eventually duty gets transformed to love.
Thank you. That explains it nicely.
Thank you, Prabhu. Okay, so if there are no more questions or points, let's move on to the next verse 9. Atra te kathayasyamam itihasam puratanam puranjanasya charitam nibodha gadato mama. In this connection, I wish to narrate an old history connected with the character of a king called Puranjan. Please try to hear me with great attention. So now starts the story of Puranjan. So Vishwanath Chakravarti says that Narad considered that this king, he's fond of material things. He's a Karmakandi. So I will enlighten him using a material story. So Narad, even though because we know it's allegorical, but Narad does not stay in this verse that it's an allegorical story, right? Later on, the king will ask him and ask for clarification. But right now, it's like Naran sitting in front of Prachinabari and saying that, let me tell you the story of an ancient king, right? So the attention of Prachinabari is immediately attracted. He's a king, another story of another king. Ancient people are always interested in history. And essentially, so the way that we will approach this is little different from. So when Narad Muni tells the story, he does not explain the allegories. He will, at the end of the story, then he will say that this means this, this means this, this means this. But what Prabhupada has done and what we'll also do, following his footsteps, is that as Narad Muni speaks the verse, Prabhupada explains the allegories. He explains what the metaphors are, so that it helps us in the understanding. But we have to keep this in mind, that from the perspective of Prachinabari, this is an historical tale, right? And Narad Muni is an expert preacher, so he speaks in a way to best engage the attention of the king, right? So we know that in the second canto, when Sukadeva Goswami first begins to speak, he describes the Virat Rupa to engage the persons who are materially vested. Similarly, in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna first speaks about the Jiva. Like he first speaks about the audience. Then he speaks about himself, that how can he be seen in matter? Right? In 7th and 9th and 10th chapter, how he can be seen in matter. Then he says, how can matter be seen in him? In the Chaturshloki. Right? So this is the art of engagement in preaching. It's not that Krishna developed the theme as he spoke to Arjuna. He always knew that pure devotional service is the highest, but he spoke in a way to engage Arjuna and the audience. Vishwanath Chakravarti says that allegorical stories are aprastutta prashansa. So prashansa means glorification, aprastut means indirect. So indirect glorification by conveying the message indirectly. Now, actually, the story of Maharaj Puranjan is the story of Prachinabari. No difference between the two. But if Narad Muni had started off by saying that to Maharaj Prachinabari, now even though he did say that you have killed animals and they're there, but if he had continued on that way in saying that you're a slave to your senses, your intelligence is contaminated, etc., would not have made much progress in touching the heart of Prachinabari. But people, they find it much easier to be objective about others. Right? So if a person himself has a bad habit, and the person himself is a chronic speaker, he keeps speaking on and on and on, and then you go to the person and you say, do you know this other person? He speaks so much, and because he speaks so much, he's not able to hear, he's not able to listen, he's upsetting other people. And the person will say, yeah, I've noticed it. That's definitely his problem. He speaks a lot. So he will be much more quicker to identify the shortcomings if it is presented in somebody else. Now, the ultimate goal is that the person will realize that these shortcomings are actually within himself, right? So Srila Prabhupada would sit and criticize impersonalists. Those impersonalists, they're doing this, those impersonalists, they're doing that. And then the devotees later on said that they realized that Prabhupada was actually criticizing them because they had all strong impersonalist tendencies. But he was not saying you. He was saying those. And they would happily sit and listen, considering the fact that somebody else is being criticized. And when their heart was sufficiently open, then they could understand, okay, this is me. So that's the route that Narad Muni is taking. From an allegorical perspective, Narad Muni says that I will tell you an ancient story. So Itihasam means history, Puratanam means old. So from an allegorical perspective, what it means that whatever this story is conveying has been going on since time immemorial. It's not that it happened now, or it's not that it will stop late in the future, but it's been happening since time immemorial, right? So in the scriptures, it is said, Updesho hi murkhana prakopaya na shantayi. That Updesho hi murkhana, that if a foolish person is given good instructions, prakopaya na shantayi, he will simply become, prakop means very angry, and he will reject the instructions. So Narad Muni is not wanting to instruct Maharaj Prachinabhari directly. Rather, he wants him to see the faults in Puranjan and then introspect on it, and then see that he has those faults in himself. So there are 4 reasons that Narad chose to give the instructions in an allegory. 1, that material persons like to hear the accomplishment of other materialistic persons. So therefore, Narad Muni tells the king that now I will tell you the ancient story of another king. Second is that Narad wanted the king to stop performing animal sacrifices. Now, we discussed that the sacrifices that he was performing were recommended in the Vedas. Now, what would be the way then for him to stop animal sacrifice? One is that Narad Muni could follow the path of Buddha. Buddha said, reject the Vedas. Like, we are following animal sacrifices, the Vedas give you the animal sacrifices. To stop it, reject the Vedas. Narad Muni does not want to go that route. So he is taking the more subtle route of showing the dangers of Karmakanda. That even though there are injunctions in the Vedas, such injunctions are like walking on the razor's edge. A slight discrepancy can cause enormous harm, which he will illustrate in this story. Third point is that those who are mulas do not like to be criticized directly. So Narad Muni wanted to bypass the mountain of false ego and speak directly to the soul. Fourth point he wanted to indicate was how the activities of Karamkanda are troublesome. So in the second point, he was specifically wanting to stop the killing of animals. Here he is trying to indicate the general principle of the dangers of Karamkanda. Prabhupada writes that in order to wear a gold or a diamond nose ring or earring, one has to pierce the ear or nose. Such pain endured for the sake of sense gratification is endured on the path of Karmakanda, path of fruitive activity, which is called also Karma Kandiya. A person who is very much attached to material activity is called Vishayi. A Vishayi is an enjoyer of Vishaya, which is eating, sleeping, mating, and defending. Narad Muni is indirectly indicating through the story of King Puranjan that eating, sleeping, mating, and defending are troublesome and risky. Now, it's important to understand where the instructions are allegorical and where they are factual. So there is a class of philosophers, mostly they're Mayavadis, who believe that the majority of the instructions in the scriptures are allegorical. Like Prabhupada would say that Radha Krishna, when he says that he comments on Bhagavad Gita, and when Krishna says, surrender unto me, then what he actually means, he's speaking in metaphors, what he actually means is that you surrender to the impersonal in me. So what metaphors do is that they allow the person some amount of freedom in interpreting it. Because a metaphor is essentially its poetic license. They don't have any scriptural truths in them. They're just poetic license. That the eyes were beautiful like lotus leaves or like lotus flowers. Right? Doesn't mean that there was a lotus flower over there, but there is some poetic license in comparing the beauty of one object to another. This conversation between I think Yamunacharya is the grand guru, the guru of Ramanujacharya. And when he was a small child, he went to the Gurukul, which at that time they were all teaching Shankaracharya philosophy. And the teacher was basically so there was some verse in which the eyes of the Lord are compared to Kapidwaja. And Kapidwaja means compared to the beauty of the lotus. And this particular teacher, another meaning of Kapi also is the rectum of the monkey. So he was saying, the Vedas are saying that just like the backside of the monkey is red, the eyes of the Lord can also be considered as red. And then Yamunacharya got very, very angry. He started crying and he was a small child. We actually then challenged the teacher, defeated him. But the point is that that people are not morally properly situated. Either they can exploit the metaphors to give different understandings, or they can consider them as metaphors. Like one of the offenses to the holy name. What's the fourth? The fifth offense is to consider the glories of chanting Hare Krishna as imagination. The sixth offense is to give some interpretation on the holy name of the Lord. So these are people who say that when it is said that one name of Krishna can destroy more sins than you can commit in all the lifetimes. So these are just poetic exaggerations. They're just to enthuse people. Once Prabhupada was sitting in the airport and a reporter came to him. And so he knew a little bit of philosophy, and he says that, you say that chanting of this mantra, it will liberate one? Prabhupada said, yes. So the reporter said, okay. And then he chanted Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna. He chanted the mantra. And he said, so Swamiji, am I liberated now? I don't feel any different. So then Prabhupada said, he showed him in his hand. He said, I have the tickets to board the plane. But I need to go and get onto the plane. So by chanting, you have now got the qualification to take the next step, which is more chanting, to take the next step. But you need to take the steps. Because one step can lead to the next and can lead to the next, they are considered to be not different. So from our perspective, it is important to understand when it is an allegory, and allegory essentially is the metaphor that runs over a narration. Like generally, metaphors are singular, that something is compared to something else. But when the metaphors are stitched together over a narration, it becomes an allegory. Lot of the so-called scholars, they say that the description of the universe in the 5th canto of the Bhagavatam is allegorical. Right? They say that they don't actually, they say it's an attempt for somebody to explain what they don't really understand. Right? This is why Srila Prabhupada asked for a working model of the universe to be made as per the description given in the Bhagavatam. Now, if that model is made perfectly, it will, at the end of the day, it does not prove that this is how the universe works. But it will also not disprove the statements of the Bhagavatam. Right? So, it's unlikely that a scientist, so the whole Vedic planetarium is being made in Mayapur. It's very unlikely that a scientist will come and read it and say, okay, now I understand. There's a working model here, now I will understand. But at least what it will do is that demonstrate that the statements made in the Bhagavatam are provable. That the Bhagavatam described a model, and there is a model that is made according to the description in the Bhagavatam, and this is what it is. So Prabhupada is working on what is known as the cooked rice hypothesis. The cooked rice hypothesis is that if you have a vessel full of rice, and if you have to test that it is cooked, you just need to take one grain and test it. You don't have to go to every grain and test it. So that's why Prabhupada used one aspect of the Bhagavatam and says that if I can use this aspect to demonstrate that the statements are valid, it means that the entire Bhagavatam is valid, which means that the entire Vedic scriptures are valid, which means that Krishna consciousness is valid. So this instills tremendous amount of faith in the heart of the honest seekers. Okay, moving on. Verse 10. Asid Puranjano Nama Rajarajan Brahakshavaha Tasya Vigyata Namasi Sa Sakha Vigata Chestitaha. My dear king, once in the past lived a king named Puranjan, who was celebrated for his great activities. He had a friend named Avigyata, the unknown one. No one could understand the activities of Avigyata. So we'll see that as Narad Muni tells the allegorical tale, Srila Prabhupada will explain the allegory in the purport, and he will also expand upon it from a perspective of application. Right? So Narad Muni begins the story by saying, Rajarajan. Rajarajan means, O king, there was a king. So he's creating this empathy between Prachinavadi and Puranjan. Just like you're a king, there was a king, Rajan. The verse is essentially introducing the main character of the allegorical story, the protagonist, which is the conditioned soul, the jiva. Right? So Puranjan is essentially representing the conditioned soul. Avigyata, and you certainly guessed now, is the super soul that accompanies the conditioned soul. So the name is also used to signify a message. So every living entity is Puranjan. So the word Puran means without this body. I'm sorry, the word Puran means within this body and within this form. And Jana means living entity. So Puranjan essentially means a living entity that is within the, that is embodied, that is within the body. So Narad Muni is preaching to everyone at the same time, right? So he says Rajarajan to get the attention of Prachina Bari, but then he's also saying that this personality Puranjan is not just the king, he is everyone. Each and every jiva that is an embodied body is Puranjan. Now, somebody may object out of humility that how can we consider ourselves to be a king? As we'll see later on, Puranjan is a big king. So how can we compare ourselves to being a king? So in Bhagavad Gita 15:8, the jiva is described as Ishvara, as the Lord of the body, and acts in three ways: acts in self-gratification, acts whimsically, neglecting the scriptures, and acts irresponsibly against the scriptures. Right? So Prabhupada says that a materialistic person interested in sense gratification can be called a Puranjan. Because a materialistic person utilizes his senses according to his whims, he may also be called a king. So this is another point Prabhupada makes, that a king by nature is autocratic. So the king is not answerable to anyone. He may choose to take directions from the Brahmanas or the more elevated person, but it's his choice. He can choose not to do it, right? So the same position is that of the jiva in the body. It may choose to follow the scriptures, or it may choose to neglect the scriptures. It may choose the path of renunciation, or it may choose the path of sense gratification. So that is another way the jiva can be considered to be like a king within the body. So Puranjan is glorified as Brahat-Shrava. Brahat-Shrava means one whose activities are great, or one who's famous. Shava also means fame. One who's famous for great activities. So this also applies to the jiva. So the living entity is famous from ancient times. From time immemorial, the jiva is famous for. What is it famous for? It is famous for being eternal. It is famous for being indestructible. It is famous for performing so many activities in so many bodies. Also, it means that the jiva is famous for intently listening about the activities that produce happiness in the present and in the future. Anandamai. This is one of the famous qualities of the jiva, that it is very eager to listen to those activities that produce ananda now and in the future. Now, Puranjan has a friend called Avigyata. Avigyata Chestita, whose activities are mysterious. So this refers to the Paramatma. Also means that the jiva has a friend that is mysteriously inspiring it to execute various kinds of activities. So what is the mystery over here? That although the jiva is dependent on the Paramatma, he actually considers himself to be independent. So this is actually the only place where the super soul is spoken about in this metaphorical story. And Narad Muni establishes it to clearly convey that what is it that I'm talking about. So the art of speaking in metaphors is that the person should also be specific enough so that the metaphors don't get confused. So when he's saying the jiva is accompanied by the mysterious avigyata, then one cannot now confuse who is Puranjan. I mean, one can choose to be confused, but if one is sincerely following the allegory, then one can understand that it is only the embodied soul that is accompanied by the Paramatma who is mysterious. Okay, we'll do one more verse, and then after that pause for discussion. Verse 11. Soneva shamanaha sharanam babrama prithvim prabhu nanurupam yada vinda abhutsa vimanaiva. King Puranjan began to search for a suitable place to live, and thus he traveled all over the world. Even after a great deal of traveling, he could not find a place just to his liking. Finally, he became morose and disappointed. So this verse is talking about the constant transmigration of the soul from one body to another, looking for a body that will give him happiness. And when they do not get the happiness, then the jiva becomes morose. So Sharanam means a place to live or a place of enjoyment, which is essentially the material world. So Puranjan was wandering through various, he was taking birth again and again. Prabhu means looking for enjoyment. And nature, that was because it was his nature. And Narad Muni uses the word Viman Iva. So Viman Iva means that full of anxiety. So in the material world, even Indra is full of anxiety. So Vishwanath Chakravarti says that Viman Iva, especially he says Iva, means as if morose. And the point he makes is that in the human form of life, the jiva can understand that they are unfulfilled. In the lower forms of life, because the intelligence is so much covered, they do not have the ability to detect their unhappiness. Even though there is unhappiness, there is more sufferance in the animal form of life, but they're not able to detect it. So that's why it says as if morose. So Prabhupada quotes Bhagavad Gita 8:16, Brahma Bhuvana Loka, that if Brahma is full of anxiety, then what about the living entities who are in the planets? And we will later on see towards the end of the canto, when the Prachetas will pray to Lord Vishnu, they will say that, my dear Lord, when the bee approaches the celestial tree called the Parijata, it certainly does not leave the tree. Therefore, because there is no need for such action. Similarly, when we have approached the lotus feet and taken shelter of them, what benediction shall we maybe ask of you? So the point that Prabhupada is making, that ultimately, when one reaches the spiritual destination, then this quest gets satisfied. Until then, it is just a constant, unfulfilled search for happiness. So Prabhupada has a comprehensive purport. I'll summarize it in the points. So he gives the example of hippies to show that how material opulence does not translate to real happiness. Same point he had made earlier on. And then he says the root cause of this unhappiness is because it is not their constitutional position. The conditioned living entity wants to become a master, but its actual position is that of servant. So in an attempt to seek happiness, the jiva traverses the path of karma kand, gyan kand, which are just like pots of poison. And a person who mistakes this poison to be nectar and drinks it travels in different species of life. When he does not become ultimately happy, he becomes morose or takes to the way of hippies, which is rejecting everything and looking for alternatives. So in this context, Prabhupada is using the hippies in a positive way, that they actually realize that what they have is not the real source of happiness. So they are looking for alternatives. So the conclusion is that a living entity cannot be happy because everything in the material world is unsuitable for the spirit soul. So the only solution is to surrender to the thought. Okay, so let me pause over here and see if there are any comments.
Hare Krishna, Guru. When you were talking about analogy, I was thinking about what Prabhupada regularly said about when the mother-in-law has to give instruction to the daughter-in-laws. She speaks through the daughter, through his own daughter, saying something. Then, for example, cooking chapati, give an instruction, giving it to her own daughter, so that the daughter-in-law can understand. It's like via another media to give the instruction.
You're right, and Prabhupada is very good at it. He would have the diorama built, he would have plays, and he had so many ways to attract the attention of the people. To the scientist, he would speak scientifically. So that's the quality of an expert preacher. It's not about presenting what you know, but it is presenting in a way that the other person can receive it. And Narguni, of course, is the foremost of preachers. We see him do that over and over again, by clearly ascertaining the level of the recipient and then speaking at that level and then elevating the person from there. Thank you, Prabhu.
Thank you.
Okay, if there are no more discussion, we can end now. Vanchakalpatarubhyascha kripa sindhubhya eva cha patitanam pavanebhyo vaishnavebhyo namo namaha. Anant Koti Vaishnavind ki jai, Srila Prabhupada ki jai, Thai Gaur Premanand. Hare Krishna. Thank you very much.